I'm writing this after a lot of contemplation about whether I should share it or not, but I've decided that people need to hear my story to be more aware. It's been 6 years since this happened, and as I write this, I still get paranoid just thinking about it. I'll be pretty vague with some details because to this day the fear lingers. I'm a 23-year-old female now, but I had just turned 17 when this story took place. I was working as a waitress at a local restaurant. A few months into working there, a new cook was hired. We'll call him John. At first, John seemed pretty harmless. I was and still am a very friendly person, and I try not to be rude unless someone gives me a reason to be. Even then, I avoid confrontation as much as possible. Everyone at work was friendly, and we often joked around and pulled harmless pranks on each other. John eventually joined in on the work shenanigans. I should note that I never flirted with John or showed any romantic interest in him. Our joking around always took place in group settings, never one-on-one. One evening after closing, I went outside to smoke, and John happened to be there. We made small talk, and the conversation shifted to fines and tickets. I mentioned a recent speeding ticket I had gotten and how I had no idea how I'd pay for it, since I was still in high school and working limited hours. Fast forward a few weeks. During this time, John and I exchanged small talk, but I never gave him any signals that I was interested. Then came Valentine's Day. The restaurant was slammed with customers, and I was busy at the register. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw John standing nearby, just watching me. I figured he was waiting to clock out, so I told him to give me a second. Once I finished helping the last customer, I motioned for him to use the register. Instead, he handed me a giant box of chocolates and said, "Happy Valentine's." Then he clocked out and left. I was stunned and confused. Earlier that evening, I had been complaining to a friend about how my boyfriend didn't even get me a card for Valentine's Day. Now here I was, holding a big box of chocolates from a guy I barely knew. Did he overhear my conversation and feel sorry for me? Or did he actually have feelings for me? I shrugged it off, but the answer would soon become clear. After that night, I didn't see John for about a week due to our different shifts. One day I had to head to work right after school and decided to do my hair and makeup in my car. As I finished up, a car pulled in next to mine, and I heard someone call my name. It was John. He looked excited and told me to come over. Nervously, I got out of my car and approached his passenger window. He told me to get in. Foolishly, I did. Sitting there, my palms were sweating, and my heart was racing. John pulled out an artificial rose, the kind you find at gas stations, and then a thick wad of cash. It felt like something out of a crime movie. He shoved the money into my hand and said it was for me. I sat there, stunned, the cash feeling heavy in my grip. After a long, tense moment, I managed to ask, "What's this for, John?" He replied, "It's for your speeding ticket. I've been in trouble with the law before, and I don't want to see anything happen to you." I knew deep down that if I accepted the money, there would be strings attached. Gathering my wits, I set the cash on his dashboard and said, "I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept it. It's your money, and it's my responsibility." I got out of his car and went inside to clock in, shaken but relieved. After that, things got even stranger. John began giving me gas station roses every chance he got, and his behavior became more unsettling. He'd text and call me constantly, trying to get me to hang out with him. He'd also stare at me at work with a sad, desperate look. I was a 17-year-old girl, and he was a 30-year-old man. I did my best to avoid him, even asking my boss to schedule me for shifts when John wasn't working. He eventually got fired for a no-call, no-show. A couple of months passed, and I eventually quit that job. I changed my phone number and switched carriers. One night, while waiting for my best friend outside her boyfriend's house, my phone buzzed with multiple texts from an unknown number. There were 10 messages, all long and emotional. As I read them, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was John. He was confessing his love for me and demanding to know why I was ignoring him. My stomach churned. How did he get my new number? My best friend, who had just gotten into the car, noticed my distress. She read the texts and suggested I call my mom. I was too scared of how my mom would react, so I didn't. Suddenly, I got a call from another unknown number. When I answered, I only heard slow, deep breathing before the line went dead. My friend urged me to block the number, and I did. But over the next month, I kept getting calls and texts from different numbers. Every time I'd answer, the breathing would be there. Eventually, it all stopped. Fast forward 6 months, and I had completely changed my life. I moved out of my mom's house, got a new car, and even started a new job. One Monday, I was at my mom's doing laundry and picking up my mail. She handed me a white envelope addressed to me. There was no stamp, just my name and my old workplace's address as the return. I opened the letter and felt my blood run cold. It was from John. He said he missed me, loved me, and even mentioned wanting to start a family with me. The most chilling part: the envelope had no postage stamp, which meant John had driven to my mom's house and put it in the mailbox himself. My mom asked what was wrong, and I lied, saying it was an old friend informing me of someone's death. I left, trying to hold myself together. At a gas station on the way home, I ripped up the letter and threw it away, hoping that would be the end of it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that John was going to try to find me again. A few weeks later, while driving to work, I noticed a red car following me. John had driven a blue car when we worked together, so I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But when the car followed me down every turn, I knew it was him. I sped to my grandfather's house and ran inside, terrified. My grandfather and great-uncle, both armed, confronted John and told him to leave. John drove off, but not before giving me a look that said, "This isn't over." My grandfather followed me home for the next few days, and I took every precaution I could. A month later, paranoia still gripped me. I deleted my social media, saw a counselor, and had my works resource officer walk me to my car. One day, I learned from a coworker that a man matching John's description had come looking for me while I was off. Later that night, a coworker who looked similar to me was followed home by a red car. Thankfully, her mother scared him off with a gun. That was the last major incident. Years later, I still check up on John from time to time. Though he never physically harmed me, the lengths he went to find me were terrifying. I've since moved, gotten married, and started a family. But just the other night, after a long shift, I found a gas station rose on my doorstep. I'm a 27-year-old female now, but this story happened when I was only 19. At the time, I was living in Littleton, a suburb of Denver. I worked at a hair salon and lived in an apartment right across the street. I shared a chaotic studio apartment with 4 other people. It was far from ideal, but I was young, naive, and worked so much that I was hardly ever home except to sleep. While working at the salon, I met people from all walks of life. Most of them were nice and hardworking, just like me. The plaza where the salon was located, however, had its fair share of loiterers, mostly homeless drunks. One man in particular stood out. He always smelled like booze but seemed friendly enough. He was quite the flirt, which made 19-year-old me uncomfortable. He often asked me to hang out and drink with him, and I always declined, telling him I had a boyfriend. I can't remember his name, so for the sake of the story, I'll call him Mark. One afternoon, I got off work around 4 p.m. and headed to a nearby coffee shop. I ordered a drink and sat outside to enjoy the sunny weather. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark approaching quickly, a broad smile plastered across his face. He asked me for a lighter, and although I was reluctant, I handed it over. He lit his cigarette and returned the lighter, intentionally brushing against my arm. A disgusting chill ran up my spine, and I pulled away, suddenly feeling the need to leave. I stood up and told him it was time for me to go. He begged me to come drink with him, but I declined and walked away. After that, I didn't see Mark for several weeks, which was a relief. He was usually lurking around the plaza, waiting to prey on anyone who dared to make eye contact. One evening, I decided to go for a nighttime stroll. I loved walking at night, especially in that season, because the weather was perfect. I usually looped around downtown Littleton and made my way back to my apartment. I was about 10 minutes from home when I saw a figure in the distance. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of people were out and about, but as I got closer, I realized it was Mark. He was swaying unsteadily on the sidewalk, nearly falling into the road. Here's where I made my first mistake. I should have crossed the street or turned around. Instead, I decided to walk past him, hoping he wouldn't recognize me in his drunken state. Unfortunately, he did. He blocked my path with that familiar broad smile. I sighed, resigning myself to having to deal with him. Trying to keep things casual, I asked how he was doing and if he'd had a good day. He replied that he was fine, but that his day would be much better if he had someone to drink with. I told him I couldn't because I had work early the next morning, but he didn't care. He kept begging, trying to use his drunk puppy dog eyes to persuade me. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I forced a laugh and tried to maneuver around him. He spread his arms to block my path. With a serious voice, I demanded that he move out of my way so I could go home. Something in him seemed to snap. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. I winced and tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. He stepped closer and grabbed my other arm, squeezing hard enough that I knew it would bruise. The pain triggered my fight or flight instinct, and I chose both. First, I shoved him as hard as I could, pushing him into a nearby bush. Then I sprinted down the sidewalk, not stopping until I burst through my apartment door. I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. My roommates rushed over, alarmed, and tried to comfort me, asking what had happened. Once I calmed down enough to speak, I told them about Mark's attack. My boyfriend, who was in the apartment at the time, was furious. He grabbed a bat and stormed out to look for Mark, while one of my roommates stayed with me. My boyfriend came back a while later, frustrated that he hadn't found him. We considered calling the police but decided against it, because we weren't exactly on the right side of the law ourselves. Marijuana wasn't legal in Colorado yet. Instead, I bought pepper spray and started carrying a knife with me. It made me feel safer, and I stopped going on nighttime walks unless my boyfriend came with me. Strangely, I never saw Mark again after that night, and I was more than okay with that. So wherever you are now, Mark, just leave me alone. Next time I'll be ready to defend myself. This happened to me about 4 years ago. I'm 23 now, so I was 19 at the time. It was a late weekend night, and I was up playing video games as usual. A storm was raging outside, strong winds, probably up to 50 miles per hour, and heavy rain pelting down. The storm was intense enough that I worried about the power going out, which often happened during bad weather. After a few hours of gaming, I started feeling hungry and decided to make a snack. I live in a mobile home community, where the homes are fairly close to each other. While I was making a sandwich in the kitchen, I suddenly heard a few popping sounds from outside. At first, I thought it was just thunder, but then I heard a couple more pops. Curious, I looked out the window next to the back door, facing the direction of the noises. The only thing I could see was the dim glow from a lamppost on the street behind my house. Dismissing the sounds as part of the storm, I finished my snack, turned off the lights, and went back to my game. About 10 minutes later, I heard a noise coming from the front door. I had a motion light on the front porch that would go off at the slightest movement, and sure enough, I could see the light shining through my bedroom window. Now I was getting creeped out. I was home alone, and the combination of hearing a strange noise and seeing the motion light triggered was unsettling. I made my way through the dark house and approached the front door, which had a diamond-shaped window in the center. I crouched down to stay out of sight and slowly lifted my head to peek out. There was nothing there. I cautiously opened the door and stepped into the rain, scanning the area, but still, there was no sign of anyone. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I went back inside and locked the door behind me. As I walked back to my room, I noticed flashing blue lights coming through the window on the back door. Curious, I looked outside and saw at least 3 police cars parked on the road. 2 officers were talking to someone who lived in one of the mobile homes nearby. I watched for a bit, but eventually lost interest and returned to my game. It wasn't until the next day, when I saw the news, that I realized just how close I had come to danger. The popping noises I had heard the night before had been gunshots. According to the police, a drug deal had gone horribly wrong, and 2 men had been killed execution style. One had been shot in the head, and the other had been shot multiple times in the chest while sitting in a chair. The police believed it was gang-related. One of the victims was identified after a family member reported him missing, and the other was the owner of the mobile home, who had apparently arranged the meeting with the drug dealers. Things had clearly taken a violent turn. Terrified, I came forward to the police after seeing the news. I explained what I had experienced that night, and the police agreed that what I heard on my porch could have been the killer trying to get inside my home. They speculated that the gunman, hearing me moving through the house, might have realized someone was home and run off. With no car in the driveway, he might have assumed the place was empty until I made noise. I never heard back from the police after giving my statement, so I don't know if the killer was ever caught. But it still haunts me to think about what could have happened if he had decided to force his way inside, or if I hadn't heard the noises that alerted me to his presence. I consider myself incredibly lucky to have never come face to face with the killer that night. Always stay safe, you never know who's lurking out there in the dark. There's always a reason to be cautious. In the summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room. I was working on some school assignments, and my brother and boyfriend were playing a video game in the next room. They were considerate enough to keep the volume down so I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered that I needed to put gas in my car. After finishing the last paragraph of my essay, I called my parents to let them know I'd be gone for a few minutes and would be coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes from my house, so I expected to return in roughly 20 minutes. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left. After a 10-minute drive, I arrived at the gas station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started filling up my car, I noticed an old, beat-up pickup truck out of the corner of my eye. Two shadowy figures sat inside, and though I couldn't make out any details, they seemed to be talking and scoping out the area. I tried to ignore them and finish pumping gas. Before getting back into my car, I decided to run inside and grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I quickly selected a few items and paid at the counter. Just as I was finishing my purchase, two men burst into the store, guns drawn. They were wearing jeans and black hoodies, both appearing to be in their mid-20s and well-built. "Everybody get on the ground," one of them yelled. The cashier and everyone else obeyed immediately. There were a few panicked whispers until one of the men barked at everyone to be quiet. My heart was pounding and my blood ran cold. I feared that they were going to rob the place and possibly harm the customers or the cashier. Silently, I prayed that no one would get killed or seriously hurt. One of the men grabbed me by the hair and commanded, "You, stand up." Terrified, I did as he ordered. Almost instantly, he twisted my wrist and gripped it tightly. I wanted to fight back, to stomp on his foot or elbow him, but I was paralyzed with fear. The worst part was feeling the cold barrel of a gun pressed against the back of my head. I squirmed, trying to break free, but he only tightened his grip and hissed, "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man yelled at the cashier, "Hand over the cash, or you're going to be scraping this girl's brains off the wall." The cashier, an older man in his 60s with glasses, looked scared but willing to do anything to protect me. He quickly unlocked the register and began handing over the money. As the robber took the cash, I felt the gun press harder against my head, and tears welled up in my eyes. My throat burned as I held back sobs, trying to stay as calm as possible. Once the last dollar bill was taken, the man stuffed the money into a backpack and punched the cashier. I was thrown aside, hitting my stomach and arm on the counter before collapsing onto the floor. The robbers ran outside, but police sirens blared immediately. Within seconds, officers surrounded them, tackling and handcuffing both men. I struggled to catch my breath, but my main concern was the cashier. I pulled myself up and peered over the counter. He appeared to be okay, although his right eye was bruised and his glasses lay shattered on the ground. "Are you all right, sir?" I asked weakly, my stomach aching. "I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be fine," he replied. Just then, a familiar voice asked if everyone was okay. It was a police officer who was a close friend of my dad. "Just us two," I managed to say. The officer recognized me and asked if I needed medical attention. I explained everything, and other officers began questioning the remaining customers. It turned out that a customer had sneaked into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning was over, I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer and broke into tears, not from pain, but from the sheer terror of what had happened. I just wanted to go home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was taken to the hospital on a stretcher. "Do you need medical attention?" the officer asked. I shook my head, crying, "I just want to go home." As I left the store, I saw officers inspecting the old pickup truck and realized it belonged to the robbers. They had been watching the gas station, waiting for the right moment to strike, and I was likely the first person they saw, using me as bait. A police car escorted me home that night. As we pulled into the neighborhood, my mom ran out and hugged me tightly. She kept asking what had happened, but I was crying too hard to answer. My boyfriend wrapped me in his arms as soon as I walked in, holding me until I calmed down. My dad's friend explained everything to my family. Later, as I lay on the couch with an ice pack on my stomach, my brother asked me what happened. Since it was bedtime, I promised to tell him in the morning. I didn't want to scare him. I was still shaken by the experience and made a vow to myself I would never go to certain places at night again. This happened 2 years ago, and it still makes me uneasy thinking about it. My husband, our then 2-year-old daughter, and I moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start. We were all exhausted after the long drive and just wanted to unpack the mattresses. My parents, who already lived in Tennessee, were helping us unload, naturally. All the neighbors in our apartment complex came out to say hi. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes from him. Our daughter, who even today is usually too friendly with strangers, hid behind my husband and cringed visibly. We made some small talk, but mostly focused on unloading our belongings. Later, my dad told me that he had caught Ben staring at our daughter. When my dad confronted him, Ben denied it, but my husband told him to back off. That night, while we were still organizing our things, our daughter stayed with my parents. Around 10:30 p.m., we heard a knock at the door. Thinking it was the pizza I had ordered, my husband answered it, but there stood Ben. He asked if we needed help, which was odd and unsettling at that hour. Before we could turn him away, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he being weird, but now he was outright rude. We told him we didn't smoke, and he got angry, yelling at my husband and pounding on the wall. Thankfully, our landlord lived nearby and came out to tell Ben off. The landlord explained that Ben had a troubled past and suffered from mental health issues, but was supposedly harmless as long as he took his meds. Not exactly comforting news for our first night there. Life eventually settled in, and we adjusted, though we had erratic schedules, often working graveyard shifts. I'd get home around midnight and see Ben lingering outside, staring at me. I was too tired to engage, so I just ignored him. He kept asking for cigarettes, and both my husband and I repeatedly told him we didn't smoke. We even adjusted our work hours to avoid him, but he started bothering us during the day, even on our days off. Once, he asked if he could come with us on a family outing, claiming he was great with kids and could be trusted alone with our daughter. My husband nearly punched him, and in hindsight, I wish he had. When we returned home from that trip, Ben was sitting in our parking spot, saying he was protecting it for us. He tried to hug our daughter, who screamed and clung to me. My husband finally snapped and told Ben to leave us alone. We reported him to the landlord, but they brushed it off, citing his mental health. We tried to be understanding, but our daughter was terrified of going outside. It got so bad that we threatened to break our lease unless something was done. I started talking to other neighbors who shared similar stories. One mentioned that Ben had been caught leering at young girls in bathing suits by the pool. Although it was reported, the landlord did nothing. After about a month, Ben seemed to disappear. We hoped he had moved away. One night, I got home from work early. My husband was out of town, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit family. I decided to play Saints Row 4 to unwind after an 11-hour shift. Suddenly, around 10 p.m., there was a loud knock at the door. No one we knew would show up unannounced that late. As I approached, the knocking grew violent, and I heard Ben screaming, "Let me in. Open this goddamn door." He started slamming his shoulder against the door, screaming like a maniac. I grabbed my phone and the sharpest knife I could find, then hid in the closet. I know, cliché, but I wanted distance if he broke in. I called 911, and luckily, other neighbors had also called. It was only when I heard sirens and shouting outside that I felt safe enough to come out. A cop had been pinned on the ground, and the landlord was yelling at the officer to let Ben go, even shoving him. Both Ben and the landlord were arrested. I gave my statement, and my neighbors backed me up, sharing their own experiences. One sweet, church-going neighbor called my husband and parents, then invited me to stay with her family for the night. I couldn't sleep at all, afraid I'd hear Ben's deranged yelling again. It turns out Ben was a registered sex offender, and the landlord knew but had overlooked it because Ben's family paid him extra. Ben had supposedly been off his meds for months. He even tried to tell the cops that our daughter was his, and that we had kidnapped her, along with some wild claims about me having an affair with him. Crazy, right? The last I heard, Ben was institutionalized, either in prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and practically run out of town. We were offered 3 months of free rent but decided to leave. We sold most of our things and moved in with my parents. We have a house now, and our daughter isn't scared to go outside anymore. And yes, we checked our new neighbors for any red flags. I've never had the best luck with guys and seem to have poor taste when it comes to dating. After separating for good from my child's father following 5 years together, I was ready to focus on myself. About 3 months into being a single mother, my neighbor approached me, saying that his friend Steve wanted to meet me. It didn't take long for Steve to charm his way into my life. The first 6 months were amazing, but then he began drinking more and more. His behavior became increasingly agitated, and he would start fights with random people, even some of our friends. Gradually, our friends stopped coming around, knowing how Steve got when he drank. But that didn't stop him from drinking. Instead, all his anger was now directed at me. Over the next 6 to 8 months, his aggression escalated. What began as name-calling and shoving eventually turned into punching and choking. The relationship became horribly abusive. Once, I escaped out of a bathroom window, but he later found me by beating up a friend of mine until the friend revealed where I was hiding. In a drunken rage, Steve stripped off all my clothes while laughing at me, daring me to try and escape naked. The worst night of abuse came later. Before Steve started drinking that night, I mentioned that my 3-year-old son wasn't feeling well, and that I planned to stay with him until he fell asleep. I intended to spend the night in my son's room. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door creak open. I lay there pretending to be asleep, holding my breath as tears welled in my eyes. Suddenly, I felt his hand grab my hair, yanking me out of bed. He whispered menacingly, "I know you're avoiding me." He dragged me into the living room and threw me onto the floor, accusing me of trying to leave him. Before I could respond, he decided in his drunken state that I was seeing another man. "If I catch you with another man, I swear to God I'll kill you and him," he threatened. He was more intoxicated than usual and punched and kicked me several times. I fell to the floor and tried to crawl toward my son's room, but he blocked me, asking mockingly, "Where do you think you're going?" He knelt in front of me, warning, "You stay right there or I'll hurt you real bad." He then sat on the couch, watching me as I sobbed on the floor. After about 30 minutes, he appeared to pass out. I saw this as my chance to escape. I put on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and quietly crept past him. Just as I was slipping by, he suddenly grabbed my leg and asked, "Where are you going?" I stammered, saying I was just getting my son a drink. He glared at me and said, "Hurry up." As soon as I reached the kitchen, I bolted out the front door, carrying my son. I had no pants, no shoes, and no purse, but I ran as fast as I could to the police station, which, thankfully, was only a few blocks away. After hours, the police station entrance had a small room with an intercom. I ran inside, pressed my back against the wall, and pushed the button, sliding down to the floor with my son in my arms. I kept waiting for Steve to burst through the door. My only thought was that if he beat me, at least it would be on camera. I heard a voice on the intercom, "How can I help you?" All I could do was cry. I couldn't get any words out. 2 officers quickly came out to assist me. A female officer took my son and got him some food while I went with a male officer to make a report. He wrapped me in a blanket. 15 minutes later, I heard Steve screaming my name as officers dragged him down the hallway. I held my breath, terrified he somehow knew I was there behind the door. Soon after, another officer and a sergeant came to talk to me. At first, I feared they would tell me to go back home to gather my belongings while Steve was in custody. Instead, they asked more questions about his anger issues and previous violent incidents. I explained how his alcohol problem had turned him into a monster. Then they showed me something that made my blood run cold. A handwritten list they had found in Steve's possession, detailing how he planned to dismember my body and hide it in a location where no one would find it. The list included possible dates, some of which were already crossed out. I couldn't breathe as I read it, tears streaming down my face. I looked at the officer and asked, "What does this mean?" He replied, "It means you're lucky. Steve was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. Before leaving for Arizona, I gave a detailed statement but left before the trial started. Steve, of course, pleaded not guilty, but he ended up getting only 2 years in prison. Just before I left, I received a letter from him. It simply read, 'It's not over. You'll always be mine.'" I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved there when I was about 6 months old. I was originally born in a small town called Mount Clemens, the same town where Dean Cain from The Adventures of Lois and Clark was born. I suppose that's my biggest claim to fame. Michigan is quite a unique state, with its position on the northern border of the US and the southern border of Canada. Those of us born here usually stay, and hardly anyone ever travels to my neck of the woods. It's not a place you just pass by, landlocked by the Great Lakes, if that makes sense. Except for the large cities, the state is mostly covered by woodlands. I've had a few strange experiences living in the Upper Peninsula, but none stranger than the one I'm about to tell. We lived on top of a hill, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. Our closest neighbors were a good 10 miles away. It was quiet and few, if any, vehicles ever passed by the house. I developed a strange fear of cars coming up the hill, as you could hear them for miles. There were others who lived on our road, but it wasn't a place for outsiders to take shortcuts. We didn't even have names for our roads, they were all designated by numbers. When I got older, I wasn't as excited or afraid when vehicles would pass by during the day. I knew most of the cars and trucks that belonged to our distant neighbors. But at night, it was a different story. Headlights cutting through my bedroom window would light up the walls like ominous, shifting patterns. It's hard to describe, but I always felt that no one should be driving down our remote road after dark. At the time, I was about 13 years old. It was 1996, and our family had just gotten the internet. Anyone in their mid to late 30s knows how insane that time was. For whatever reason, my dad installed a glass sliding door on the wall near where the computer was set up. Back then, the computer was the hub of our home, unlike today when everyone has their own devices. The view from the sliding door, overlooking the countryside, was pretty nice. I appreciated it for about 2 days before one of the strangest things I've ever seen happened. I was up late on a Saturday night at the computer, probably messing around in Yahoo chat rooms or maybe playing Myst. Then, I heard it, or rather, felt at first the low rumble of a truck engine creeping slowly down the main road. The truck passed our house and then stopped. The long-forgotten fear I mentioned earlier came roaring back. Nothing good could come from a suspicious truck on our road at 1 in the morning. What happened next is burned into my memory. The truck screeched to a stop, and a man flung open the passenger side door. He hustled over to the driver's side. From the distance, I couldn't make out much detail, but I could see that the passenger was larger than the driver. He wore a puffy vest, jeans, and a trucker cap. The larger man grabbed the driver, dragged him out, and slammed him against the tailgate. He seemed to be shouting orders, motioning for the driver to open the back of the truck. When the driver hesitated, clearly frightened, the passenger forcefully handed him a shovel. The passenger then pointed to a spot on the side of the road behind the truck, and the panicked driver began to dig frantically. After about 3 or 4 minutes, the driver paused. The two exchanged words I couldn't hear. Then the passenger dragged something out of the truck bed. It looked like a closed sleeping bag, but the shape inside suggested there was a body. He tossed it into the shallow hole, and the two men made a poor attempt at covering it before speeding off. You may be wondering, did I go out and see what they buried? The answer is probably what you'd expect. Yes, I did. The next morning, I went out to the road. The hole was empty. I knew what I had seen. The tire tracks from the night before were still there, but whatever they buried was gone. Even creepier, there were footprints leading away from the hole, disappearing into the forest. I had no idea what to make of it. I've repressed that memory for so long, pretending it never happened. Aside from a few close friends, I've never told anyone. I believe the bag had someone in it, and those men thought the person was dead. But based on what I saw the next morning, they were wrong. You might think it was just teenage imagination, but I stand by my story. Some things in this world can't be explained, and even if they could, chances are you wouldn't want to know the truth. A couple of years ago, there were reports of a woman being attacked in my area. This was shocking because my community had recently managed to get rid of a bunch of drug dealers who used to operate in the neighborhood, and gang activity had significantly decreased. We were all looking forward to a peaceful, crime-free environment. Unfortunately, that peace didn't last. At the time, I was 17 and living in an apartment building. The attack on the woman was brutal. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten unconscious. Over the next few months, at least a dozen other women were attacked in a similar manner. Few details were released to the press, likely because the victims were too terrified to speak publicly about their experiences. Thankfully, all of them survived, but none could give a clear description of the assailant, as he always ambushed them from behind in the dark. All the women were attacked while walking home from work, suggesting that the perpetrator had been stalking them and learning their routines before striking. The entire community was on edge. You could feel the tension in the streets. Husbands and fathers would rush their families indoors as soon as the sun began to set. Children were forbidden from playing outside after dark. It was winter and the days were short, so the streets became eerily empty every evening. One day, my grandmother came to visit us. My mom had come down with a bad case of the flu, and my grandmother spent the day with us, keeping her company. We got so caught up in conversation that by the time Grandma was ready to leave, it was completely dark outside. Letting her walk out there alone felt wrong, so being the brave but foolish teenager I was, I volunteered to walk her to the bus stop. At just 5, I wasn't exactly a bodyguard, but who in their right mind would let their grandma walk alone with a serial attacker on the loose? We made it to the bus stop without incident. I waved goodbye to my grandmother as her bus pulled away. A crowd of people had just gotten off the bus she boarded, and as it drove off, I suddenly felt like someone was watching me. I turned around quickly and saw a dark figure standing under a lamp post just down the street. I froze, heart pounding. The recent attacks had been on my mind all evening, and now I found myself nearly alone, staring at a shadowy, ominous figure. Panic took over, and I broke into a run. I caught up with the small crowd of people who had gotten off the bus and weaved through them, sprinting home as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds, terrified. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was in hysterics. Now I know nothing technically happened to me, but I was so scared that I decided to call the non-emergency police number to report the suspicious man at the bus stop. It seemed like a harmless thing to do. A while after making the report, an officer called me back. They were determined to catch this guy and followed up on every lead. Using the bus stop security footage, they managed to get a full description of the man, which matched exactly what one of the victims had described. A couple of days later, I learned from the news that they had arrested someone in connection with the attacks. The night before I saw him at the bus stop, he had nearly killed a female police officer who was patrolling in an area where one of the previous attacks had occurred. He had attacked her from behind and beaten her almost to death with a crowbar. Fortunately, she survived, but her assault likely motivated the police to act urgently. I later discovered that the man had been at the bus stop that night looking for more potential victims. I'm so grateful I followed my gut and called the police. I like to think that my call contributed to the capture of a very dangerous man. Hopefully, he spends the rest of his life behind bars where monsters like him belong. My best friend is a social media influencer. She's not a big-time celebrity, but she has a large enough following to get free stuff and has even scored a couple of sponsored trips. She works a full-time job but does the Instagram thing on the side, mostly for the perks. She hasn't reached the point where she can make a living from it, but she's gotten some great opportunities. In 2018, she was offered her first sponsored trip. A small boutique hotel in Miami contacted her through Instagram. They offered an all-expenses-paid trip for Memorial Day weekend in exchange for her staying at the hotel, taking pictures, and doing a couple of Instagram stories. They even told her she could bring a female friend along, and everything would be covered. Since it was her first time doing this, she didn't really know how things worked. The hotel sent her a contract which seemed legitimate, but in hindsight it was bogus. The contract stated she would need to pay for her plane ticket up front and would be reimbursed later to prevent no-shows, which sounded reasonable at the time. Instead of bringing a female friend, she invited me, I'm a guy, because she was nervous about the whole situation. We figured that, at worst, they might not cover my ticket, and if that happened, she said she'd pay for me herself. The day arrived and we flew to Miami. We were supposed to be picked up at the airport by someone from the hotel. Sure enough, there was a man holding a sign with her last name and the hotel's logo. He greeted us and escorted us to a black SUV. That's when things got strange. As soon as we got in the car, the driver seemed angry. We thought he was arguing with the man who escorted us, but he was actually addressing my friend. He had a thick accent, wore dark sunglasses, and started ranting about how she wasn't allowed to bring her boyfriend, referring to me. 2 girls, he kept repeating. Hotel said 2 girls, no 1 girl, 1 guy, 2 girls. He was clearly upset and demanded to know where the other girl was. We were speechless and confused. The man who had walked us to the SUV looked frustrated and got into the passenger seat, where he and the driver started arguing in what sounded like Portuguese. Finally, he turned around and demanded to know where the second girl was. My friend, who was now visibly upset, explained that she was the influencer they'd contacted on Instagram and that I was just a friend accompanying her. The man in the passenger seat got out, angrily threw our luggage onto the curb, said something like, "This is some fucking bullshit," and got back into the car. They sped off, leaving us in shock. My friend immediately emailed the PR contact, a woman named Melissa, but got no response. We decided to take a cab to the hotel. When we arrived, things began to make sense. The hotel had been rebranded with a completely different name. We showed the staff the Instagram account, and while it was the official account of the old hotel, the new management claimed they had never contacted us. Whoever had been running the old Instagram account had used it to lure us. The account had over 10,000 followers and looked legitimate. Upon closer inspection, we realized the posts and photos were old. My friend felt humiliated and ended up breaking down. We called the police and met with a detective, but despite an investigation into who had access to the account, nothing ever came of it. It's terrifying to think that whoever was behind that account intended to abduct my friend or another unsuspecting girl by posing as a reputable hotel. The account has since been deleted, and we never heard anything more. To this day, the thought that my friend could have been kidnapped if she'd brought another girl instead of me sends chills down my spine. This is my dad's story from about 35 years ago. I'm going to tell it from his perspective, exactly as he shared it with me. I grew up on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. When I was younger, my friends and I went camping pretty often since it was something we could do to drink and have fun despite being underage. When I was about 18, my friends and I decided one weekend to camp near a lake called Small Fry. It wasn't too far from Portland, but far enough to feel like an escape. It was a pretty last-minute plan, so we only brought some blankets and a case of beer that my older brother had bought for us. After school on Friday, we headed out. When we arrived, we found a cleared-out area where we could easily park our car. We started a small fire and had a few beers, but we quickly got bored. That's when we decided to go for a midnight swim. The area where we parked wasn't near an official trail to the lake, but it was only about half a mile away, and we felt confident we knew the direction. My 3 friends and I were already buzzed, as we were lightweight drinkers at that age. We set out into the forest, heading toward the lake. This was the 80s, so we didn't have cell phones with maps to double-check our route. We trudged through the forest, sure we were going the right way. About 15 minutes in, everything changed. It had been a warm, almost summer-like night, around 70 degrees. But as we kept walking, the air grew colder and colder. Suddenly, I felt every hair on my body stand up. Without saying a word, we all turned around and ran back to the campsite as fast as we could. We didn't speak a single word to each other, not even a whisper about turning back. I've never run that fast in my life. As bad as it sounds, my only thought was that I couldn't be the slowest. I didn't want to be the one who didn't make it out. I can't explain why, but at that moment we all felt an intense primal fear. It felt like something was chasing us, something that wanted to harm us. We finally made it back to the car, unlocked it quickly, and sped away. We left the fire burning and abandoned all the clothes and blankets we had brought. The car ride home was completely silent. When we got back to my house, my friends got in their cars and left. We never spoke about that night again. A few weeks later, summer had finally arrived. My family went on our annual camping trip with a few other families we were close to. One night, as about 20 of us sat around the campfire, someone from one of the other families brought up a strange hiking story. He said that he and his wife, along with a few friends, had gone hiking one Saturday. When they got to the trail, they were surprised that no one else was there, even though it was a popular spot and should have been busy. They hiked up the trail and reached the top of a cliff overlooking the lake. But once they arrived, he said he felt like he couldn't speak. The whole group suddenly turned around and hurried back down the trail, walking much faster than usual. They didn't talk to each other at all, just quietly agreed that they needed to leave. They had brought lunch and planned to take pictures, but instead they rushed down, driven by an overwhelming sense of dread. I asked him where this hike had taken place, never mentioning my own experience. He said it had been at Small Fry Lake. Hearing that honestly terrified me because I had felt the exact same way. I kept quiet though, not wanting my parents to worry or forbid me from going camping there again. It might not be the scariest story, but I wonder if anyone else has experienced something similar in that area. When I spoke with the man and his wife, they said they had a gut feeling that they were living the last few seconds of their lives. The man even mentioned that he saw his life flashing before his eyes as they raced down the hill. I don't know what's happening at that lake or what made us all feel that way, but there's definitely something not right about that place. I never believed in the supernatural, but after that experience, it feels like the only explanation. All I know is that I'm never going back there again. This happened when I was 9 years old in 1987. I grew up in Townsend, Massachusetts, a medium-sized town on the New Hampshire border. My dad worked for a well-known local plastics company, and my stepmom worked at the Congregational Church. Every Sunday I was dragged to church with my dad's wife, whether I wanted to go or not. The one saving grace of those Sundays was the chance to play on the playground after Sunday school and the promise of cake, which they almost always had. It was one Sunday in late November when, as usual, I found myself at church. Afterward, my classmates and I poured into the churchyard to socialize and make a mess with our cake. I don't remember exactly what compelled me to approach a girl named Abby that morning. She was 2 years younger than me and much more popular. We barely knew each other and hardly ever spoke. Yet something inside me told me I needed to tell her something important. I saw her on the playground, and feeling driven by an inexplicable urge, I approached her. "Hey Abby," I said, feeling a strange sense of urgency. "You have to grow your fingernails out so if someone tries to hurt you, you can go right for their eyes." I was completely serious, and she looked at me slightly confused. "Okay, why?" she asked. I didn't have an answer, so I just shrugged. "Just do it, okay? Trust me." She nodded, still puzzled, but agreed. A week later, Abby, her younger brother, and their mother were found dead. They had been murdered by a neighborhood psychopath named Daniel LaPlante. He had broken into their home, shot and killed Abby's mother, Priscilla, and then drowned Abby and her brother, William. He managed to evade the police for 2 days, eventually being captured half an hour away in the town of Ayr. When the police arrested him, they noticed he had scratches around his eyes. I cried when I found out what had happened. It broke my heart to know that Abby and her family had been brutally murdered. Only then did I understand why I had felt so compelled to warn her. Yet, I still couldn't explain how I knew. Regardless, I viewed it as a failure on my part. I was incredibly distraught. No 9-year-old should have to carry that kind of burden or guilt, but I felt awful about what happened to Abby and her family and wished I could have done more to save her. It took me years to come to terms with what had happened. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing, and at that age, I was too young to fully comprehend it. My dad owned a small house for a brief period. He didn't live there. He bought it to renovate and resell for a profit. The house was located on our dead-end street in the woods. It was a very private area, but the road had a history of people dumping trash and abandoning stolen vehicles. There were only 2 houses on the street, and my dad's property had often been used by drifters. A neighbor once told us that it had been a drug house for a long time. A few months after my dad bought the place, he called me and asked if I could meet him there to help unload some materials. I arrived about 10 minutes before he did and noticed a car parked in front of the house. Curious, I decided to investigate and see if anyone was inside. The car still had its license plate, and there were clothes piled up in the back seat. As I walked around the car, an uneasy feeling crept over me, as if I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I heard movement in the woods near the house. I stood at the edge of the woods, watching and waiting for several minutes. My dad pulled up with his trailer a few minutes later. He got out of his truck and walked over to the car. I explained that I had a feeling whoever owned the car was still nearby and mentioned hearing footsteps in the woods before he arrived. My dad looked at the car, just as I had, and we both decided to walk through the woods to see if we could find anyone. As we walked, the sense of being watched grew stronger. I remember telling my dad how creepy it would be if we stumbled upon a dead body. He admitted that he also had the same strange feeling that we weren't alone. The path we were on eventually came to a dead end, so we turned back. When we returned to the house, the car was still there. We decided to call the police to report the abandoned vehicle. After making the call, we went inside the house to check on a few things. We were only inside for a couple of minutes, but when we came back out, the car was gone. Someone had clearly been watching us and took off as soon as we went inside. The police never showed up that night, and we eventually left. Several weeks later, a dead body was discovered in the forest near the house. It was found by a lady who had been hiking in the area. Interestingly, A neighbor had previously told her about the body, but no one took him seriously because he had a reputation for being a mentally unstable drunk. That was the rumor, anyway. After the body was discovered, the police came out to file a report. One of the detectives took a statement from my dad, but my dad noticed the detective seemed strange and uninterested. I find it hard to believe it was just a coincidence that we saw a parked car in that area not long before the body was discovered. As far as my dad knows, the police never followed up with the neighbor. A few months later, right before selling the house, my dad had a conversation with that neighbor. The story got even stranger. The hiker who found the corpse said it looked fresh, like it hadn't been there very long. The body wasn't a rotting heap, but rather intact, though the head and hands had been removed. The police, however, later reported that the body had been there for years. Something about that claim doesn't sit right with me. If the body had truly been there for years, it would have been nothing but a pile of bones and rot. It just doesn't add up. I also can't help but wonder what might have happened to me or my dad if we had found the driver of that car that day. My mother was 14 years old in 1986 when this happened. At the time, she lived in China with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter, and temperatures had plunged below zero. Snow was falling heavily, blanketing the ground in thick layers. Around 10 p.m., my mother finished her classes, and by then it was already dark. Bear in mind, in China, it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she started walking through an old marketplace to reach her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at that time of night. There were also no streetlights, making it hard for my mom to see properly. However, she had traveled this route many times before and knew her way home well. Despite this, my mother had an unsettling feeling that someone was lurking in the darkness. She tried to dismiss the fear, but the unease persisted. The only sound she heard was the crunch of her footsteps in the snow. Suddenly, she realized she could hear a second set of footsteps crunching behind her. My mom panicked but continued walking, pretending she hadn't noticed anything. She told herself it might just be another student heading home, but the sense of danger wouldn't go away. She started to walk faster, and alarmingly, the footsteps behind her picked up speed as well. Overwhelmed by fear, my mother broke into a run, but the thick snow made it difficult for her to move quickly. She glanced back and saw the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters behind her, closing in fast. He wasn't wearing a coat, even in the freezing cold. The absence of streetlights made it hard to see more details, but that wasn't what terrified her the most. As she was chased into an area dimly lit by a light mounted on the side of a merchant's stall, she noticed that her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now completely petrified, she kept running and refused to look back again. Just then she spotted the light from a lamppost on a nearby street. By a stroke of luck, a young couple was walking in her direction. Using the last of her energy, my mother ran toward them and collapsed in front of them, sobbing hysterically. The couple asked what was wrong, and through her tears, my mom explained what had happened. By then, the stranger had disappeared. It turned out that the couple lived in the same apartment block as my family and knew my grandfather. They escorted her home and informed my grandfather of the incident. After they left, my mom couldn't stop crying from the shock and fear of what had nearly happened. From that night on, my grandfather would always meet her at the bus stop and walk her home. My mom never discovered who her pursuer was, and thankfully, she never had another encounter with him. I'm 28 years old now, and this is the first time I've really thought about this incident in detail, mainly because of how traumatizing it was. I met my ex-girlfriend in California back in 2010. We had both lived there our entire lives but decided to move to Maine a couple of years after we started dating. She had flown to Maine for a business trip in 2012 and fell in love with everything about it: the small towns, the scenery, the people. When she came back, she convinced me to pack up our lives and move there, and that's exactly what we did. We saved up a lot of money and rented a huge moving truck. The plan was for me to drive the truck across the country while she stayed behind for 3 days to finish her classes at the local community college, which were wrapping up at that time. We had to take advantage of a great deal the moving truck company offered, so waiting wasn't an option. She still had her car to drive to Maine on her own anyway, and I towed my car behind the moving truck. My brother came along to help me with the drive. The drive across the country was long and exhausting. When my brother and I finally arrived in Maine, about 4 days later, we were completely drained. After unloading the truck and sleeping for 16 hours straight, we decided to visit the small town of Belfast, which was about 14 miles from my new house. We had some seafood at a little family-owned place, rented a scary movie, and then drove back to the house. My new house was in the middle of nowhere. During the day, the view of the lake and the backyard was breathtaking, and the woods surrounding the property were beautiful. But at night, the place turned into something out of a nightmare. The house was surrounded by windows, and looking out of them at night was unnerving. You couldn't see anything outside, but if someone were standing out there, they could easily see in. The day after we arrived, I had to drive my brother to the airport in Portland. When I returned to the house, I was completely alone. We didn't have any phone service, internet, or cable yet. My cell phone didn't work anywhere on the property. The only form of entertainment I had was a box of DVDs. When I got back, I decided to try out the fishing pole we'd bought in town. It got dark fast, so I didn't stay out by the lake for long. As the night closed in, I went back to the house. Sitting in the living room, I watched the view outside get darker and darker. Eventually, I turned on all the lights in the house because the darkness felt suffocating. The isolation of the woods, the pitch-black night, and the feeling that someone could be watching me through the uncovered windows made me incredibly uneasy. Trying to calm my nerves, I hung up sheets over the windows using thumbtacks. I put on a funny movie, hoping it would distract me, but it didn't help. Eventually, I decided I needed to get some sleep. I covered myself with a blanket on the couch and turned off the TV. The room was dark, but I could see faintly after my eyes adjusted. My eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up, still in complete darkness. Reaching down, I grabbed my bottle of Coke from the floor and took a sip. As I set it back down, I looked around the room, and my heart stopped. Standing in the corner of the living room was a man. He wasn't moving, and I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking at me. I was frozen in fear, unable to speak or move. It was clear he was trying to stay hidden. My mind raced as I tried to think rationally. I wasn't sure if he knew that I had seen him, as the blanket might have obscured my face. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I decided to cough and get up, hoping to make it seem like I hadn't noticed him. I stood up slowly, walked across the icy cold wooden floor, and made my way to the bathroom around the corner. He didn't move. Once inside the bathroom, I locked the door, tears streaming down my face. I backed into the bathtub, staring at the door. Then, I noticed a small window above the tub. It was my only escape. I silently moved the shower curtain aside and reached for the window lock. I unlocked it and started sliding the window open, but it squeaked loudly. I froze, praying he hadn't heard it. A few seconds later, I heard a tapping on the bathroom door. It wasn't a knock, but a metallic tap, like a knife tapping against the wood. My heart pounded as I realized he knew I was trying to escape. Adrenaline took over. I pushed the window open, removed the screen, and began squeezing through. My upper body made it out, and I couldn't see inside the bathroom anymore, only the dark, dense woods ahead. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my foot. Before I could react, a sharp pain shot through my ankle. He had sliced it open. I screamed, pulled free from his grasp, and tumbled to the ground outside. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, heaving with fear. Blood dripped from my ankle, but I didn't have time to think about the pain. I ran into the woods, hiding among the trees and trying to control my breathing. The man burst out of the back door, knife in hand, and started searching for me. He grunted as he moved through the woods, but thankfully he didn't come near where I was hiding. I lay there in the freezing cold, shaking uncontrollably. Snow covered the ground and I was terrified. About 10 minutes later, the man emerged from the woods and went back into the house. I stayed hidden until the sun began to rise, illuminating my surroundings. Only then did I feel safe enough to move. I limped around the house, saw the front door wide open, and carefully stepped inside to grab my car keys from a hook by the door. I ran to my car, started it, and drove to a small general store a few miles away. That's where the story ends. I escaped, but the intruder got away. My ankle was badly cut, but it healed over time. I also developed minor pneumonia from being out in the cold for so long. Although I've physically recovered, the psychological scars remain. This experience has made sleep difficult, but writing this down has somehow made me feel a little calmer. Thank you for listening. Always be aware of your surroundings. You never know who might be out there in the dark.